agree that President Trump undermined public trust in law enforcement by suggesting that Governor Walz was involved in the Hortman murders?
I am not familiar with that statement.
Well, that is a disappointing response, and it is also why your office and Donald Trump have zero credibility, because I know, and you know, it was a right-wing extremist who murdered the Hortmans, and you and the president are being dishonest with the American people.
3 seconds. That was the silence that filled the House Judiciary Committee chamber on the afternoon of February 11th, 2026. And it was not an ordinary pause, not a casual break in speech, but a measurable, visible hesitation that every camera in the room captured in unforgiving detail. The lights were bright, the microphones were live, and the Attorney General of the United States, Pam Bondi, had just been asked a question so simple it barely required breath to answer. 4 words, yes or no, nothing abstract, nothing procedural, nothing layered in legal ambiguity. Do you believe that President Trump is honest? The air did not move for those 3 seconds. And in Washington, 3 seconds can feel like 3 hours when power is on the line. Bondi did not speak immediately. And in that delay there was calculation, and in that calculation there was awareness, and in that awareness there was the unmistakable recognition that whatever came next would not disappear into the routine noise of partisan theater. This was not about policy nuance or statutory interpretation. It was about credibility. And credibility, once fractured, does not mend easily. Every member in that room understood that the answer would define more than the moment. Representative Sydney Kamlager-Dove had not stumbled into that silence by accident. She had watched Bondi for hours before she ever uttered that question, had studied the pattern that unfolded again and again across the hearing. Bondi deflected when pressed, pivoted when cornered, attacked when challenged, and refused to directly address questions about Donald Trump's conduct. She had brushed aside concerns about Epstein survivors, had dismissed members of Congress mid-sentence, and had treated direct inquiries as political nuisances rather than constitutional oversight. Kamlager-Dove recognized a rhythm in Bondi's strategy, a predictable choreography of avoidance that relied on exhausting the questioner rather than answering the question. Instead of confronting facts head-on, Bondi created noise, redirected focus, and leaned on the authority of her office as though the title itself insulated her from scrutiny. That pattern was not subtle, and it was not accidental. It was a shield, and shields only work until someone stops swinging wildly and starts aiming precisely. So Kamlager-Dove did not begin with the honesty question. She did not rush to the climax. She built the foundation first, brick by brick, with a case so specific, so documented, and so internally connected to Bondi's own Department of Justice that there would be no escape hatch. She began with the murders of Melissa Hortman and her husband in June of 2025, a political assassination that shook Minnesota and rattled the nation. It was not a rumor or a disputed incident. It was a violent crime investigated by federal law enforcement, prosecuted by the Department of Justice under Bondi's leadership, and resolved through formal charges against a specific perpetrator. The facts were not speculative. The DOJ identified the killer, built the case, and brought the indictment. In a court of law, under oath, supported by evidence, the department determined responsibility. And yet, in the aftermath of those murders, Donald Trump took to social media and publicly accused Governor Tim Walz of being involved in the assassination. It was not phrased as a question. It was not framed as cautious concern. It was an accusation, direct and inflammatory, aimed at a sitting governor during a moment of national grief. That accusation traveled quickly, as presidential accusations always do, amplified by loyal media and repeated in political echo chambers. Kamlager-Dove understood the significance of that statement, but more importantly, she understood what it meant in relation to Bondi's own office. If the Department of Justice had formally charged someone else, if federal prosecutors had stood in court and presented evidence identifying a specific killer, then by definition, Governor Walz was not involved. The indictment itself was proof. The prosecution itself was a refutation. So when Kamlager-Dove turned to Bondi and reminded her that the DOJ had brought charges against a different individual, she was not speculating, and she was not arguing ideology. She was pointing to the official record of Bondi's own department. If Walz were responsible, the DOJ would not have indicted someone else. That was not political opinion. That was prosecutorial logic. It was a clean setup. Bondi's department had established the facts in court. Trump had publicly contradicted those facts. Therefore, Trump's statement was demonstrably false. There was no wiggle room, no contextual ambiguity, no gray zone of interpretation. Either the department's indictment was legitimate or the president's accusation was. Both could not be true at the same time. Kamlager-Dove did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize the contradiction. She let it sit there, factual and unadorned, forcing Bondi to confront the collision between her department's legal actions and the president's public claims. The trap was not theatrical. It was structural. It was built on the very machinery of the Justice Department. Then she expanded. She moved from the specific to the systemic, from one demonstrably false accusation to a pattern of documented falsehoods. She began reading them, one by one, not with sarcasm, not with rhetorical flourish, but with the calm cadence of someone presenting evidence. Trump had claimed he cut gas prices by 1,400%, a figure that defied arithmetic and economic data. Trump had claimed he won the 2020 election, despite certifications, recounts, and court rulings that said otherwise. He had claimed he did not know Jeffrey Epstein, despite photographs, videos, and documented associations that contradicted that denial. He had claimed he sent water to Los Angeles during wildfires, without evidence of federal delivery. He had claimed Governor Wes Moore called him the greatest president of his lifetime, a statement Moore's office publicly denied. And in at least one instance, Bondi's own Department of Justice had produced evidence that undercut the president's version of events. It was not one misstatement. It was not a slip of the tongue. It was an accumulation, a record. Kamlager-Dove did not editorialize as she read them. She did not accuse. She simply recited, building the list into something heavier with each addition. By the time she finished, the question that followed was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Do you believe that President Trump is honest? The silence that followed was not an accident. It was the weight of all that had just been placed on the table. Bondi knew the list had been read into the record. She knew the Hortman prosecution was public. She knew her own department's filings existed in black and white. She also knew the political cost of contradicting the president who appointed her. So she waited. 3 seconds is not long in casual conversation, but in a congressional hearing it stretches across the room like a fault line. Cameras do not blink. Reporters do not look away. Members lean forward. The country watches. In that pause, Bondi was not searching for facts. The facts had already been stated. She was calculating alignment. When she finally answered, her words were direct but revealing. Of course I do. He is the commander-in-chief. She did not reference evidence. She did not address the specific contradictions just presented. She did not reconcile the Hortman indictment with the Walz accusation. She invoked the office. Commander-in-chief. As though the position conferred honesty by default, as though the oath of office immunized the holder from falsehood. And in that moment, the line between loyalty and truth became visible. Kamlager-Dove did not pounce. She did not argue over semantics. She simply pivoted to the next question, sharper and more pointed than the first. If the president publicly accused Governor Walz in a case your department prosecuted, do you agree that undermines public trust in law enforcement? The question did not challenge Trump's character abstractly. It challenged the impact of his statement on the very institution Bondi led. Bondi responded that she was not familiar with that statement. It was a stunning reply. Either the Attorney General did not know that the president had publicly accused a governor of involvement in a murder case her department handled, or she was choosing not to acknowledge it. Neither explanation strengthened her credibility. One suggested alarming detachment from presidential rhetoric that affected active prosecutions. The other suggested deliberate avoidance. Kamlager-Dove did not let the moment pass. She described it plainly. That is why you and Donald Trump have zero credibility. It was not hyperbole. It was an assessment rooted in the exchange that had just unfolded. The pattern of deflection, the hesitation, the invocation of office over evidence, and the claimed unfamiliarity with statements tied directly to her department's work. Then the questioning moved beyond one murder case and one list of falsehoods. Kamlager-Dove turned to domestic terrorism data, to reports previously published by the Department of Justice that showed far-right extremists committed more acts of domestic terrorism than left-wing extremists. The data had existed. The pattern had been documented. And under Bondi's tenure, according to Kamlager-Dove, that data was removed from public reporting. Scrubbed, not revised for accuracy, not updated with methodology changes. Removed. At the same time, the president publicly emphasized radicals on the left. The statistical evidence pointing in another direction was no longer prominently available. The implication was clear. When facts contradicted political messaging, the facts disappeared. Kamlager-Dove framed it not as partisan conflict, but as public safety. Law enforcement allocation depends on accurate threat assessment. Communities depend on transparent reporting. When data is suppressed, response suffers. When response suffers, risk increases. This was not about optics. It was about institutional responsibility. And the exchange, which began with a simple question about honesty, now revealed something broader. If honesty is defined by loyalty, if evidence is subordinate to position, if inconvenient data can be scrubbed, then credibility erodes not in theory, but in practice. The hearing did not collapse into chaos. It did not require shouting. It unfolded through methodical contradiction, through record against rhetoric, through silence measured in seconds. By the time Kamlager-Dove concluded with 2 words, "Do better." The indictment was not emotional. It was structural. And in that chamber, under those lights, the question was no longer whether the president was honest. It was whether the institutions sworn to uphold truth were willing to defend it. The chamber did not erupt after those 2 words. There was no dramatic gavel slam, no shouting across the aisle, no theatrical collapse into partisan chaos. What lingered instead was something heavier and far more consequential than noise. It was the unmistakable recognition that a line had been crossed, not in tone, but in institutional integrity. The words "do better" were not an insult. They were an indictment of a standard that had slipped below the weight of the office it was meant to carry. Pam Bondi sat there still cloaked in the authority of Attorney General, but authority without credibility is a fragile shield. The exchange had exposed a fracture between position and proof, between power and principle. When Kamlager-Dove read the 6 documented falsehoods, she did not need exaggeration. The accumulation was the argument. Each statement, on its own, might be dismissed as political spin. Together they formed a pattern, and patterns are far harder to defend than isolated missteps. The list mattered because it was specific. It was not an abstract accusation that the president sometimes bends the truth. It was a documented sequence of claims that could be checked against public data, court records, photographic evidence, and official denials. Gas prices did not drop by 1,400%. That number was mathematically implausible. The 2020 election was not won by Trump. Courts across the country affirmed that reality. Photographs and testimony confirmed his familiarity with Jeffrey Epstein. Federal disaster records did not reflect emergency water shipments to Los Angeles under his directive. Governor Wes Moore's office explicitly rejected the praise attributed to him. And at least one of those contradictions intersected directly with Bondi's own Department of Justice. That intersection was the pressure point. It was one thing for a political surrogate to defend a rhetorical flourish. It was another for the nation's top law enforcement official to vouch for honesty after evidence from her own department refuted a presidential statement. That was no longer partisan theater. That was institutional contradiction. When Bondi responded that Trump was honest because he was the commander-in-chief, she did more than answer a question. She reframed honesty as hierarchical rather than factual. She implied that the office confers integrity, that the title itself validates the claim. But the Constitution does not state that the presidency erases objective reality. It does not declare that statements become true by virtue of the seal behind the podium. Kamlager-Dove understood that point and did not need to belabor it. Instead, she moved the focus to consequence. What happens when a president accuses a governor of involvement in a murder case that federal prosecutors have already resolved? What happens when that accusation contradicts an indictment signed under the authority of the Department of Justice? Public trust does not erode slowly in those moments. It fractures instantly. Bondi's response that she was not familiar with the statement did not dissolve the contradiction. It intensified it. The Attorney General of the United States claimed unfamiliarity with a presidential accusation directly tied to a high-profile political assassination her department had prosecuted. The explanation left only two possibilities. Either she did not monitor public statements that could undermine active prosecutions, or she chose not to acknowledge them. Neither option projected confidence. Neither option reinforced trust. Kamlager-Dove's declaration of zero credibility was not rhetorical excess. It was a conclusion drawn from the pattern unfolding in real time. Credibility rests on consistency between word and record. When the record contradicts the word and the word refuses to reconcile with the record, credibility evaporates. And that evaporation did not stop at the Hortman case. The shift to domestic terrorism data widened the scope from individual statements to institutional transparency. The Department of Justice had previously published analyses indicating that far-right extremist actors were responsible for a greater share of domestic terrorism incidents than left-wing extremists. That data did not originate in partisan blogs. It emerged from law enforcement assessment, from the aggregation of incidents, arrests, and intelligence evaluations. Under Bondi's leadership, according to Kamlager-Dove, that data no longer appeared in the same public reporting format. Scrubbed was the word she used, and scrubbed carries implication. It suggests deliberate removal, not accidental omission. It implies awareness that the information existed and a conscious decision to extract it. In a climate where the president repeatedly emphasized radicals on the left as the primary domestic threat, the disappearance of contrary statistical evidence was not trivial. Data shapes policy. Data directs funding. Data determines which threats are prioritized and which are minimized. If law enforcement assessments indicate one pattern of extremism, but public messaging emphasizes another, the disconnect is not academic. It affects resource allocation, training emphasis, and community preparedness. Removing data does not remove danger. It removes clarity. Kamlager-Dove framed the issue precisely that way. She did not accuse Bondi of mere partisanship. She accused her of compromising public safety. If the American people cannot see the full scope of domestic threat assessment, they cannot hold institutions accountable for response. Transparency is not optional in democratic governance. It is foundational. Bondi did not engage deeply with the data claim. The hearing had already established the rhythm of her defense. Avoid specifics, invoke authority, claim unfamiliarity when cornered. The pattern had become predictable, and predictability in deflection weakens its effectiveness. What made the exchange powerful was not emotional outburst. It was structural coherence. Kamlager-Dove's questioning followed a deliberate arc. Begin with a prosecutorial fact. Expand to documented falsehoods. Force a binary answer. Expose hesitation. Challenge the consequences. Broaden to systemic transparency. Conclude with a moral imperative. Each step built on the last. Each contradiction tightened the frame. The 3 seconds of silence at the beginning now felt emblematic rather than incidental. In that pause, Bondi was not simply searching for phrasing. She was weighing allegiance against evidence. The eventual answer revealed which side prevailed. Loyalty to the office of the presidency, and perhaps to the individual who occupied it, eclipsed engagement with the documented record presented moments earlier. This was not the first time an attorney general faced political tension. History is full of moments when law enforcement leaders were pressured to align with executive narratives. What distinguished this exchange was the visibility of the conflict. It was not hidden behind closed doors. It was displayed in open session, with cameras recording every second. The American system depends on a delicate balance. The Department of Justice operates within the executive branch, but it is expected to maintain independence in prosecutorial judgment. The Attorney General is appointed by the President, but the oath is sworn to the Constitution. When public statements by a president contradict the findings of federal prosecutors, the Attorney General stands at a crossroads. Silence is a choice. Deflection is a choice. Direct confrontation is a choice. Bondi chose alignment through abstraction. Commander-in-Chief. That phrase reverberated beyond the hearing room. It suggested that the structure of command supersedes the substance of truth. It implied that criticism of presidential statements is disloyal rather than factual. But democratic accountability does not function on deference alone. It functions on verification. The Hortman indictment existed in black and white. The data on domestic extremism had existed in public reports. The list of 6 statements could be checked against economic data, court rulings, photographic archives, and official denials. None of those sources rely on partisan framing. They rely on documentation. And documentation, when ignored, does not disappear. It lingers. The broader implication of the exchange was not simply that a president had made false statements. Political figures have stretched truth before. The deeper concern was that the nation's chief law enforcement officer appeared unwilling to reconcile those statements with her own department's findings. That reluctance does not stay confined to one hearing. It seeps into public perception of institutional integrity. Public trust is cumulative. It builds through consistent alignment between action and explanation. It deteriorates when explanation conflicts with record. Once diminished, it is difficult to restore. Law enforcement depends on voluntary cooperation, on juror confidence, on the belief that investigations follow evidence rather than political directive. When a president accuses a governor of murder involvement contrary to a federal indictment, and the Attorney General does not publicly correct the record, observers draw conclusions. When data highlighting a specific extremism pattern is removed during a period of politically convenient messaging, observers draw conclusions. And when confronted with documented contradictions, the response is hesitation followed by invocation of title. Observers draw conclusions. The exchange at the House Judiciary Committee was not about partisan victory. It was about narrative control versus factual accountability. Kamlager-Dove did not invent the facts she cited. She relied on publicly verifiable information. She anchored her argument in prosecutorial records and published data. That approach insulated her from accusations of exaggeration. It also placed Bondi in an unenviable position. To dispute the claims would require contesting her own department's actions or widely documented evidence. To acknowledge them would create distance from the president. She chose a third path. Minimize engagement. Redirect to authority. Claim unfamiliarity. Maintain alignment. But the silence at the beginning lingered. 3 seconds is enough time for a camera lens to capture uncertainty. It is enough time for viewers to register calculation. It is enough time for the public to sense that the answer was not reflexive. Honest affirmation does not require rehearsal. It does not require mental triangulation. By the close of that segment, the issue was no longer confined to whether Trump was honest. The issue was whether the mechanisms designed to hold truth above politics were functioning as intended. When loyalty overtakes evidence, institutions bend. When institutions bend repeatedly, they risk breaking. And the hearing did not resolve that tension. It illuminated it. Kamlager-Dove's final command, "Do better," echoed not as a partisan jab but as a civic demand. It was directed not only at Bondi but at the standard of governance itself. The expectation that public officials align statements with facts. The expectation that data be transparent. The expectation that the Attorney General defend the integrity of her department above political convenience. The afternoon session ended, but the implications did not. Outside the chamber, analysts dissected the pause. Commentators replayed the clip. Supporters framed it as unfair attack. Critics framed it as exposure. But the transcript remained unchanged. The record reflected the 6 statements. The record reflected the indictment. The record reflected the claim of unfamiliarity. The record reflected the invocation of Commander-in-Chief. Records matter. They endure beyond talking points. They form the basis for oversight, for historical evaluation, for public judgment. In that sense, the exchange became more than a moment. It became documentation of a choice to equate position with honesty, a choice to sidestep contradiction, a choice to treat inconvenient data as optional. And as the country watched, the question lingered in the silence that had started it all. If truth can be reframed as loyalty, what remains of accountability? If truth can be reframed as loyalty, what remains of accountability? That question did not fade when the microphones dimmed. It traveled beyond the hearing room, beyond the polished wood desks and the rigid posture of committee members, and into the broader civic bloodstream. Because what unfolded that afternoon was not a spontaneous clash. It was a collision between 2 models of governance. One model anchored itself in documented evidence, prosecutorial record, and institutional transparency. The other model anchored itself in allegiance, hierarchy, and the insulation of office. Pam Bondi stood at the intersection of those models. As Attorney General, she was entrusted with a mandate larger than any administration. The Department of Justice does not belong to a president. It belongs to the constitutional framework that created it. Its legitimacy depends on the perception that it applies law consistently, regardless of political convenience. When that perception erodes, the consequences ripple outward. Sydney Kamlager-Dove's questioning exposed that fragility without theatrics. She did not accuse Bondi of corruption. She did not launch into ideological denunciation. She presented contradictions and waited. That waiting forced the country to witness the gap between record and response. The 6 documented statements were not obscure claims buried in minor interviews. They were public pronouncements amplified by the authority of the presidency. Each carried weight. Each influenced millions. And each had verifiable counterpoints grounded in data, judicial rulings, or physical evidence. The gas price claim was not a minor exaggeration. 1,400% is not rhetorical flourish. It is a number that collapses under elementary scrutiny. The 2020 election claim was not unresolved ambiguity. It was litigated across multiple jurisdictions, adjudicated by judges appointed by presidents of both parties. The denial of knowing Jeffrey Epstein collided with images and documented associations preserved in public archives. The wildfire water claim encountered the absence of federal delivery records. The alleged praise from Governor Wes Moore encountered categorical denial. And layered within that accumulation was the Hortman case, the most concrete of all. A murder investigation resolved by Bondi's own Department of Justice. An indictment signed, a perpetrator charged, a case prosecuted. Against that formal legal conclusion, a public accusation by the president targeting Governor Tim Walz. The contradiction was not philosophical. It was procedural. Either the DOJ's findings were correct or the accusation was. Bondi never attempted to reconcile that conflict directly. Her statement of unfamiliarity served as insulation. It created distance without resolving tension. But distance does not erase responsibility. The Attorney General does not operate in isolation from presidential rhetoric. When the president speaks about cases prosecuted by the DOJ, the integrity of those prosecutions is implicated. Kamlager-Dove understood the power of institutional silence. When a false accusation is made at the highest level and the Department of Justice does not publicly counter it, the absence of correction can be interpreted as tacit tolerance. That tolerance can erode public trust in the neutrality of federal investigations. If citizens begin to believe that prosecutions are subordinate to political narrative, cooperation diminishes. Confidence declines. Public trust is not sustained by title. It is sustained by transparency and consistency. Bondi's invocation of Commander-in-Chief suggested that allegiance to executive authority superseded engagement with contradictory evidence. That framing may satisfy political loyalists. It does not satisfy constitutional expectation. The oath of office is not a pledge to a person. It is a pledge to uphold law impartially. The domestic terrorism data intensified that tension. Before Bondi's tenure, Department of Justice reports indicated that far-right extremist actors accounted for a greater proportion of domestic terrorism incidents than left-wing extremists. Those reports were not political manifestos. They were analytical compilations derived from case data, intelligence assessments, and prosecutorial records. They informed how threats were categorized and prioritized. Under Bondi's leadership, according to Kamlager-Dove, that data was removed from public dissemination. The removal did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in a political climate saturated with messaging about radicals on the left. It occurred while presidential rhetoric emphasized one threat profile over another. In that context, the disappearance of contrary statistical evidence assumed significance beyond bureaucratic adjustment. Data shapes narrative. Narrative shapes perception. Perception shapes policy. If official reports no longer reflect the documented distribution of extremist violence, policymakers may redirect resources in ways that do not align with actual threat patterns. Communities may misunderstand risks. Oversight committees may lose clarity. Transparency is not decorative, it is operational. Kamlager-Dove's framing of the issue as public safety rather than partisan dispute was deliberate. She did not claim that highlighting far-right extremism diminished concern about other forms of violence. She argued that suppressing accurate data undermines preparedness. Law enforcement cannot allocate effectively if political messaging distorts threat assessment. Bondi's reluctance to engage deeply on that point reinforced the perception of selective acknowledgement. The hearing's structure amplified this perception. Each time a contradiction emerged, Bondi defaulted to abstraction or unfamiliarity. She did not contest the specific statistics cited. She did not present alternative data. She did not offer methodological justification for the removal. The absence of substantive rebuttal left the allegation hanging. In democratic oversight, unanswered allegations do not dissipate. They accumulate. By the time the exchange reached its crescendo, the pattern was unmistakable. Present evidence. Receive hesitation. Hear invocation of office. Encounter claimed unfamiliarity. Move to next contradiction. The rhythm did not vary. That rhythm told a story. It suggested that the Department of Justice under Bondi prioritized alignment with executive narrative over reconciliation with public record. It suggested that when evidence and messaging collided, messaging prevailed. That perception, whether fully accurate or not, carries weight because perception drives legitimacy. The American legal system rests on an assumption that facts are ascertainable, and that institutions will honor them even when inconvenient. When that assumption weakens, skepticism expands. Skepticism toward law enforcement does not confine itself to partisan lines. It affects juries, witnesses, communities. 3 seconds of hesitation became emblematic because they revealed internal conflict. If the answer had been immediate, reflexive, uncalculated, It might have been dismissed as partisan loyalty. The pause suggested awareness. Awareness that the documented record contradicted the simplicity of the question. Awareness that affirming honesty required overlooking the list just presented. Awareness that denial would fracture allegiance. Bondi chose affirmation. That choice was political. It was strategic. It was defensible within a loyalty framework. But it left unaddressed the core issue raised by Kamlager-Dove. How does an attorney general reconcile sworn testimony about honesty with documented contradictions? The broader implication extended beyond one president or one administration. It touched on a recurring tension in American governance, the proximity of the Justice Department to executive power. The attorney general is appointed by the president, but the credibility of the office depends on independence. That independence is not measured by rhetoric. It is measured by action in moments of pressure. The Hortman case was such a moment. The domestic terrorism data was such a moment. The list of 6 statements was such a moment. In each instance, the opportunity existed to clarify, to distinguish between personal allegiance and institutional record. Instead, the response remained anchored to position rather than proof. Kamlager-Dove's final words, "do better," were not shouted. They did not require volume to carry force. They were a reminder that the standard for Attorney General is not mere loyalty. It is stewardship of justice. Stewardship demands confrontation of inconvenient facts, not avoidance. The hearing transcript would not change after that day. It would record the questions, the answers, the pauses. Analysts could debate interpretation. Supporters could contextualize. Critics could amplify. But the sequence itself was immutable. 6 documented statements. An indictment contradicting a presidential accusation. A claim of unfamiliarity. An invocation of commander-in-chief. Allegations of scrubbed data. A declaration of zero credibility. 2 words of admonition. The arc was complete, yet the implications continued to unfold. If institutions become instruments of narrative rather than guardians of record, the distinction between fact and loyalty blurs. When that blur spreads, governance becomes reactive rather than principled. Accountability transforms into performance. Transparency becomes conditional. The American experiment depends on the opposite trajectory. It depends on institutions that withstand political pressure. It depends on officials who can distinguish between allegiance to a person and allegiance to constitutional principle. It depends on data that informs rather than conforms. The House Judiciary Committee hearing did not settle those questions definitively. It illuminated them. And in the illumination, the country saw not only a moment of hesitation, but a mirror reflecting the tension at the heart of contemporary governance. Whether that tension resolves toward greater transparency or deeper entrenchment remains uncertain. But the record of that afternoon stands as evidence that the question was asked plainly, the contradictions were presented clearly, and the silence before the answer spoke volumes. And the silence before the answer spoke volumes. It was not merely the absence of sound, it was the presence of conflict, compressed into a few suspended seconds that revealed more than any prepared statement could have. In that silence, the tension between evidence and allegiance surfaced in its rawest form. The Attorney General of the United States had been confronted with documented contradictions, and the only thing standing between acknowledgement and affirmation was calculation. Calculation is not inherently dishonest. Public officials calculate consequences constantly. They measure impact, anticipate reaction, weigh strategic cost. But when calculation replaces candor in response to factual contradiction, the foundation begins to shift. The Department of Justice is not meant to calculate truth. It is meant to uphold it. Sydney Kamlager-Dove did not need to dramatize that principle. The exchange had already done the work. By structuring her questioning around verifiable facts, she removed rhetorical escape routes. The Hortman prosecution was not speculative. The 6 statements were not rumors. The domestic terrorism data was not invented. Each element rested on record. That record constrained the conversation. It prevented the discussion from dissolving into partisan accusation. Pam Bondi's responses revealed the limits of alignment when confronted with documentation. Invoking Commander-in-Chief as justification for honesty did not address the list that preceded it. Claiming unfamiliarity with the Walz accusation did not reconcile the indictment signed by her department. Avoiding substantive engagement with the data removal did not refute the allegation. Each answer preserved political alignment, but left factual tension unresolved. That unresolved tension is what Kamlager-Dove labeled zero credibility. Credibility does not vanish because an official defends an ally. It diminishes when defense overrides reconciliation with evidence. It collapses when contradiction is met not with explanation, but with evasion. In governance, credibility functions as currency. Once depleted, institutional authority loses weight. The exchange highlighted an uncomfortable reality. Public trust in law enforcement depends on the perception that prosecutions are insulated from political narrative. When a president publicly contradicts a DOJ indictment and the Attorney General does not correct the record, observers infer alignment. When statistical data disappears during politically convenient messaging, observers infer manipulation. Those inferences may not capture internal deliberations, but perception shapes legitimacy. Legitimacy is fragile. It cannot be sustained solely through title or oath. It requires consistency between public record and public response. The House Judiciary Committee hearing became a case study in what happens when that consistency fractures. The broader stakes extended beyond one administration. They touched on how democratic institutions survive pressure. Throughout American history, attorneys general have faced tension between executive loyalty and institutional independence. Some chose confrontation, others chose accommodation. Each choice left a mark. Bondi's choice that afternoon was accommodation through abstraction. She did not dispute the documentation presented. She did not present counter-evidence. She did not clarify discrepancies. She chose to reaffirm allegiance and minimize engagement. That path maintained short-term alignment, but deepened long-term questions about independence. Kamlager-Dove's strategy amplified those questions deliberately. By anchoring her argument in official records, she shielded herself from accusations of exaggeration. She did not need to speculate about motives. She did not need to assign intent. The contradictions spoke for themselves. Her closing words, "do better," were not a personal rebuke. They were a call to restore alignment between office and obligation. Truth, in that chamber, became the central character. Not partisan truth, not rhetorical truth, documented truth. The type of truth recorded in indictments, in court rulings, in data reports. The type of truth that persists even when inconvenient. When that truth is sidelined, the cost is not limited to one exchange. It reverberates across public confidence. 3 seconds of hesitation became symbolic because they suggested awareness. If the Attorney General had no doubt about the President's honesty in light of the documented contradictions, the answer would have been immediate. The pause implied recognition that the record complicated the claim. It implied awareness that affirmation required disregarding what had just been presented. That disregard carries implications. If evidence can be compartmentalized for the sake of allegiance, the line between governance and narrative blurs. When that blur becomes normalized, oversight loses effectiveness. Congressional questioning becomes performance rather than accountability. The hearing demonstrated the opposite dynamic. It showed that structured oversight can expose tension without theatrics. It showed that methodical questioning can illuminate contradiction without shouting. It showed that a simple yes or no question, placed after a sequence of documented facts, can force a reckoning. Bondi's invocation of Commander-in-Chief may resonate with supporters who view loyalty as strength, but constitutional design does not equate authority with infallibility. The presidency does not confer exemption from factual scrutiny. The Attorney General's oath does not require unconditional affirmation of executive narrative. The domestic terrorism data issue reinforced that principle. Threat assessment is not ideological branding. It is operational necessity. If far-right extremist violence comprises a significant portion of domestic incidents, acknowledging that fact does not weaken law enforcement. It strengthens preparedness. Suppressing or minimizing it for narrative convenience weakens clarity. Kamlager-Dove's insistence that the removal of data endangered public safety reframed the debate. It was not about embarrassing an administration. It was about ensuring that communities receive accurate threat information. Transparency is not partisan. It is protective. Bondi's failure to substantively address the data allegation left a void. In that void, suspicion grows. When officials do not provide explanation for changes in reporting, observers fill the gap with inference. Those inferences may be charitable or critical, but they arise because clarity was absent. Clarity is the antidote to erosion of trust. The hearing's final arc underscored that reality. The record was clear, the contradictions were clear, the hesitation was clear, the affirmation was clear. The claim of unfamiliarity was clear. The allegation of scrubbed data was clear. The admonition to do better was clear. Nothing in the exchange was ambiguous. The implications, however, were profound. If truth becomes negotiable within institutional testimony, accountability weakens. If loyalty supersedes reconciliation with evidence, independence narrows. If data can be adjusted to fit narrative, transparency diminishes. These are not abstract philosophical concerns. They affect how citizens view prosecutions, how jurors evaluate evidence, how communities cooperate with investigations. The House Judiciary Committee hearing did not dismantle the Department of Justice. It did not resolve all tensions, but it placed them on display. It recorded them in transcript and video. It ensured that the questions were asked plainly and the answers were documented precisely. Public memory may fade, news cycles may shift, but transcripts endure. In years to come, scholars and analysts will revisit that exchange as a microcosm of a broader era. They will examine the interplay between executive rhetoric and prosecutorial record. They will analyze the rhetorical strategy of invoking office rather than evidence. They will note the calculated pause that preceded affirmation. And they will recognize that the core issue was not partisan rivalry. It was the alignment of institutional authority with documented truth. Sydney Kamlager-Dove did not claim victory in that room. She claimed accountability. She did not demand resignation. She demanded better. The difference matters. Accountability seeks restoration. Resignation seeks replacement. Her focus was on standard, not spectacle. Pam Bondi left that hearing with her title intact. The authority of the Attorney General remained. But authority without unchallenged credibility faces scrutiny. Scrutiny is not sabotage. It is democratic maintenance. The final lesson of that afternoon was simple and stark. Truth cannot be subordinated indefinitely without consequence. Loyalty cannot replace evidence without cost. Silence, when measured in critical moments, communicates as loudly as speech, and credibility, once described as zero in a public forum, becomes a benchmark against which future testimony is judged. The 3 seconds that began the exchange were brief. Their resonance may not be. Because in those seconds, the nation glimpsed the choice between allegiance and accuracy. And in the words that followed, it saw which path prevailed.